Okay, good afternoon. I am Marcia Bowen, and this is Saturday, September 16th. And I feel very privileged to be able to do this today, and I think we all, in a way, feel like we've just been through something so tumultuous. We can only be thankful that it seems like, maybe normalcy has returned. But I think we're all going to have to think about that is, we got to purge that idea from our heads, because we never want to go back to normal again. And we'll develop that a little bit further. I also wanted to dedicate this meeting to Keisha Rogers. Keisha could not be here today. Keisha suffered a terrible tragedy on August 30th, when she got the news that her dad and stepmother had drowned in the flood. And this was like a gut punch to all of us, because, as I will also go through, most of us got through this storm in relatively unscathed, most of us around here. And there's a reason for that. There's a scientific reason for that, which is part of why we have to learn the lessons of Franklin Roosevelt and the Tennessee Valley Authority, because science is the only way to begin to solve these enormous problems we're now facing. And I wanted to dedicate this to Keisha also for another reason, which is rather ironic, which is that we had discussed about a month ago, several more of us doing these meetings, and I thought to myself, well, okay, I'll do a meeting, but what am I going to do it on? Well, I guess I'll do it on the Tennessee Valley Authority. And that was before the storm. And then the storm hit. And it's like, wow, that was perfect, because it's given me a lot of insight to understanding, the way we solved a problem as a nation under Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 in the depths of a depression. And what ought to strike you as we go through this is, if we could have done it in 1933 and tame a river that's about 650 miles long, the Tennessee River, why can't we do it today? And the argument is we can't afford it, isn't it? Well, we'll go through that a little bit also further today. But as my friend Brian Lance has been saying, we're hearing that the politicians now have a new religion. You've been hearing about it. It's called infrastructure. Now everybody's talking about infrastructure. And frankly, it's music to our ears, because we've been talking about infrastructure for years. But I'll tell you what, Lyndon LaRouche actually kind of dispensed with that word and its meaning several years ago. And he actually took it to a new level called a platform of development. And this idea that as you're, like what we're going to hopefully do here in Houston is not repair, we're going to rebuild. And we're going to have to rebuild in Florida, and we're going to have to develop new technologies perhaps we don't even know right now of dealing with inevitable floods. I mean, how many floods do we have to have before, it's almost like we were talking about it earlier, it's like a wake-up call from the universe. You can interpret it one of two ways, but I think it's, it's going to be the question of mankind being brought to a much higher level of thinking. And it's already happening in much of the globe, thankfully. We're not having to, do this all from here, because China, I just saw a film on Kuala Lumpur, building a water system in Malaysia, right? Yep. I mean, Japan has these underground water containers that when it floods, and Tokyo floods a lot, they just open these holes and they get people off the streets, and they collect the water. And so, it's not the problem that we don't know what to do. The problem is it's been a Wall Street British policy not to do it. And so my idea of a new religion is that we've got to define the terms from the standpoint of LaRouche's economics. Higher levels of platform of development, new technologies and energy flux density constantly on the increase. That is the measure of, and what that will lead to is the increase of the relative potential population density. These are all terms that Lyndon LaRouche has used for years and decades. And as we've said, after the events with Harvey, with Irma, now Jose, we're hearing another hurricane may hit the East Coast by Monday or Tuesday. Not to mention the earthquake, 8.1 earthquake in Mexico, the Katia that hit, I believe, the northern part of Mexico, not to mention the Caribbean and countries like Puerto Rico, well, not country, but the state of Puerto Rico, countries like Haiti, which have really, frankly, either had virtually none or too little infrastructure, platforms of development to even be able to imagine what they must be going through now. So we have to end that colonial system. We have to end the poverty. And I wanted to mention on Keisha one more thing, because I can't show it here, although I could show it at the end when we turn the camera off. But if you want to know a beautiful 6-minute piece to look at, just put in your Google, NY Times, New York Times, colon, into the deluge, maybe slash, either way, Harvey stories / Roger, ROGER. And for those who want to stay and see it, the New York Times did a interview that included Keisha. Her father was a very well-known pastor in the area, Brookshire, Bullshire, where they drowned. And Keisha opens it with a spiritual, and that's one of the other reasons I wanted to dedicate this meeting to Keisha, is because even through the storm, and she couldn't be with us for most of the time that she was dealing with her own difficulties, she inspired us. And I think if you look at this piece, it's extremely inspiring. Now, I also wanted to open with something that was written by one of our colleagues here, Dan Leach. I think it reflects what we experienced over these last couple of weeks in the organizing. Dan Leach writes, "A sublime moment in Houston." He says, "Those of us in the LaRouche movement office in Houston were witness not only to a terrible tragedy over the last week, but also to the manifestation of a powerful and profound principle. Not only did literally thousands of first responders, police, firemen, National Guard, Coast Guard, etc., from as far away as New York and Boston pour in to help in the rescue operations, risking their lives repeatedly, but many thousands more ordinary people from all over the country came with boats, canoes, trucks, or anything that could float and get through the high water to help save the lives of people they never met. One policeman and several civilians did indeed lose their lives. It was truly inspiring to see the many examples of selfless giving, cooperation, and downright heroism the emergency brought out. Everyone, from news reporters to ordinary people, sensed that in that moment, there were no political, racial, or religious differences. There were only human beings who were in danger of suffering and needed help. People who had just been evacuated and lost their homes were out there immediately helping to get others to safety. Perhaps the most emblematic image was that of a redneck. Everyone saw this, so we know it's true. Maybe part of the famous so-called Cajun Navy. People heard of that? They come over. They're actually trained to come over with their boats and supplies, and they don't just rescue people. They stay and help people out for days and weeks on end. I mean, they're really dedicated. So imagine they come over and their boat, one boat had a big Confederate flag on the side of it. And there the person is rescuing African-American and Hispanic families. Now, isn't that ironic? Any notion that one may have had less than a month ago, Charlottesville, August 14th, I'll remind you the date, it's a little bit more than a month now, in the aftermath of Charlottesville, that America was hopelessly divided and engulfed in hate and paranoia, seemed to vanish. The tragic deaths of Donald and Rochelle Rogers, who are the father and stepmother of Keisha Rogers, in the aftermath of the storm, however, involve a higher and more profound principle. Yes, it was indeed tragic because so unnecessary. If we had lived up to the legacy of past generations and made the investments in the infrastructure projects which would have mitigated the effects of the flooding, they would not have died. The fact that they died attempting to drive to a nearby town to help a relative who they believed to be in danger not only speaks to the beauty of their souls, but heightens the tragedy. But there is a very real sense in everyone touched by this and the other stories of human loss that we should commit ourselves to a future in which this never happens again. As in war, where there inevitably is suffering and death, if the peace is truly won, the sacrifice of those lives were not in vain. There really is the palpable presence of a spirit in all of this because of the tremendous sadness and the frailty of human existence, but also of the goodness and potential nobility in most people. It is the mission of true political leadership to evoke this and to marshal it and to achieve some historical purpose. This is the mission for our association because we understand this and we are so uniquely qualified and so needed. And I mean, that has really been the principle that LaRouche has operated from all these years, is that man is intrinsically good. We're not animals, we're not beasts. We were just talking earlier about astronaut Fred Hayes' Apollo 13, which Keisha had attended his discussion, and he and a couple others here, Joel, Ian, and he made a good point, which is, you know, a pig can't fly unless you put him on a plane, right? Dolphins can't build what you can build because you're human. So with that, let me also just say, I will get to the TVA question in a moment. One of the cartoons that came out this week in the Houston Chronicle is a picture of a hurricane looming over the White House. And you know, the waves are coming to lap up at the front door of the White House. And the hurricane is named Mueller, Robert Mueller, the special prosecutor. And inside the White House it says, relax, it's still offshore. You know, it's probably, you know, the bubble of Trump speaking, right? Well, let me tell you something about Robert Mueller, just so you know. Because realize if President Trump were to adopt what we talk about here today, LaRouche's economics, were he to adopt the Franklin Roosevelt method, that is endgame for the British Empire, that's endgame for Wall Street, and that's their terror. They're terrified of this. And we've said it many times, but I'll say it again. You know, the day after Trump was inaugurated, the London Spectator ran a headline article, will President Trump be assassinated, ousted in a coup, or just impeached? Now, Robert Mueller, we know very well. Robert Mueller ran the Get LaRouche Task Force out of Boston in the 1980s assault on our organization at the federal level. He directed William Weld, John Markham, right, the Boston District Attorney's Office. He's nothing but a cover-up agent. And now what's coming out is not only, isn't it interesting that Robert Mueller was appointed the head of the FBI just a few days before 9/11/01? Isn't that convenient? This is after he did his stint in putting LaRouche in jail and trying to shut down our organization. Didn't work. He's head of the FBI and for 12 years. Usually their tenure is 10 years, but Obama obviously kept him on. And what did he do all that time? He covered up the role of the Saudis in 9/11. And the 28 pages, which we helped to get released last year. Now, something else has just come out, which is very interesting. On the eve, on the eve of the 16th anniversary, somebody's knocking on the door. On the eve of the 16th anniversary of the attack, just this past 9/11, new evidence has come out of a Saudi government directed dry run of 9/11. Did you know that? Did you know there was a dry run of 9/11 2 years before it happened?
Wow.
Yeah. And, oh, interestingly, it was two Saudi students who were in the United States who attempted to gain control of the cockpit. Now, this is before all the laws changed. Remember, after 9/11, all the laws changed, but before 9/11. So they tried to get into the cockpit, caused such disarray on the airplane. The plane landed in Ohio. Instead, it was on the way from Phoenix to Washington. It landed in Ohio. They were arrested. They were interrogated. And then the FBI let them go. How about that? And the guy who was directly responsible for this is Robert Mueller. Now, turns out the FBI just didn't realize until after they let these two Saudi students go that one of whom had been, no, I'm sorry, I'm mixing it up. Now, I'll also just point out that Robert Mueller was involved in keeping out of being interrogated. Remember the FBI informant that had two of the pilots of 9/11 in San Diego? Okay, he made sure that that FBI informant was secreted away, harbored. That's Robert Mueller for you. So don't think these guys are all powerful. The enemy is in a real frenzy. They're quite hysterical because, as I started out by saying, as I go through today what Franklin Roosevelt did with the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, what we could do now and better, because Lyndon LaRouche has taken these ideas to the highest level that is known in economic science today. And if President Trump adopts these policies, the Robert Muellers of this world, the George Soroses of this world, these guys they're going to see jail time. We're going to get justice. So I think that's the way you have to approach taking what I hope will be conveyed here today in a way that you're going to be fired up, that we got to get Congress. The one thing, Congress has got to move on the policies, Glass-Steagall. Congress has got to move on evidence that shows from the veterans of intelligence professionals who've written a memo. These are top former members of the NSA, FBI, CIA. We've had a lot of this on our website, and I can point that out to you later if you don't know where to look, LaRouchePAC.com, that there was no Russian hack. There was no hack of the Democratic National Committee emails. It was a leak to a memory stick. And they know because of the amount of data that was taken down in the short amount of time it was taken down. Couldn't have been done as a hack. Hack has to go over the internet. And they've written up a very scientific memo. They've done the forensics. It's not an opinion. These are people that are top computer specialists involved in this investigation. And they've written this up as a memo. And this should be read into the congressional record in the House and the Senate, for example. So when you wonder, well, what can you do about what I have to say here today? There's a lot you can do. But I also want you to take in the message I have here today on how Franklin Roosevelt did deal with the tremendous flooding of the Tennessee River Valley. So let me start with the first picture. Anybody know where this is?
Story Park.
Yes.
Right here.
This is Story Park. Now, this Story Park is on Beech Nut and 8 behind the HEB. And if you're like me, you've probably gone to this park several times and enjoyed. It's a beautiful park. Next slide, Mike.
In Houston, Texas.
In Houston, Texas. Thank you. In Houston, Texas. Help me out.
Yes.
From the audience there. This is one of the walkways. So, you've got about 2 miles of this kind of gradation. Next picture.
That's also a dam. That's a dam where they want.
It's a dam. Thank you. It's a dam. And you see how it's meant to fill up with water. And I didn't know this. I've lived here 14 years. I had no idea that for some reason our part of town, even though, Beech Nut is terrible and always floods when it rains, but we've not had the kind of flooding here that a lot of, well, much of the city got, we saw it in this latest flood. Why? Next slide. Because of this guy, Arthur's story. Now, I think I have written it out on the next slide. This is, by the way, go back. This is a picture taken at the park. And like I say, most people, you know, you go for recreation. Do you ever stop and read this? Well, honestly, I think I did, but I didn't put two and two together. But then I have it now where we can read it. Arthur L. Somebody want to read it from the audience? Can you see it well enough? Can you or not?
Arthur L.
Go ahead.
Arthur L. Story was appointed executive director of the Harris County Flood Control District in September of 1989 after a 20-year career as a consulting civil engineer. He is a registered professional engineer and holds degrees from Rice and Lamar University. Under Story's leadership, the staff and budget of the Flood Control District was restructured to accomplish major economies.
That's what it says on the sign.
And productivity.
Yeah.
Capital funding for flood control was returned to a pay-as-you-go basis, eliminating reliance on debt-based financing through the sale of bonds. The district's partnership with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was strengthened. Story's public reputation was developed through his belief in open government and his support for environmental sensitivity and multiple uses of public open space. District lands today often contain trails, parks, natural areas, and recreation facilities standing alongside and in harmony with flood control features. He advocates, quote, the development of flood control projects that work with appropriate regard for community and natural values. This park, dedicated in 1997 and named for Arthur L. Story Jr., is the type of facility he promotes. Later in his career, Story was promoted to executive director of a new county Department of Public Infrastructure. There, as county engineer, he led 5 divisions: architecture engineering, flood control, toll road construction programs, and right-of-way. He retired from Harris County on January 30th, 2015.
Okay, we can have the lights and turn off the slides for a few minutes. Mike. So now, Arthur Story is still alive today. And he's been interviewed on Channel 13 Fox News. He's been interviewed a lot. The Dallas Morning, well, I'll get to that in a moment. He is fuming. He's fuming about what happened because he was head of the Harris County Flood Control in the late 1990s. And in an article that came out in the Dallas News last week, September 5th, entitled, As Houston Grew, Officials Ignored Once-in-a-Lifetime Chance to Spare Thousands from Flooding. And in a report dated May 1996, and I thank Brian Lance because he's done a lot of this work, he's read the reports, engineers for the Harris County Flood Control District concluded the area's reservoir system was severely insufficient and imperiled thousands of properties. Oh, the report's authors proposed a $400 million fix. Oh, that's a lot of money. Which would carry a massive underground conduit that would carry water out of the reservoirs. The report reads like a prophecy of the flooding that swamped West Houston and the surrounding areas. And as Arthur Story has said, he's been quoted to say, I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed. My embarrassment is that I knew enough that this was going to happen, referring to an epic flood, which we probably haven't seen the last of these floods. But I was not smart enough, I was not bold enough to fight the system, the politics, and stop it. Now, it's just too bad we didn't intersect with him in the 1990s because we were out in the streets. And as I was saying, we weren't just talking about infrastructure, we were talking about platform of development, energy flex density, we were talking about FDR, we were looking at all the examples of history. We were out there telling the population at the same time. Okay, so the idea of this, I can't show you the article, but the idea of it is that what you would have at the time that Katy Freeway was being built, Highway 10, So all the ground is dug up. And these engineers put forward this idea. Let's build this culvert under the highway, which would have 8 12 by 12 concrete portals to absorb the water when it flooded. And that's exactly the area, if people don't know the geography, where the massive flooding, particularly if you've heard the Buffalo Bayou area, when they had to release the water out of the Addicks and Barker reservoirs, which were designed when? Anybody know when those two?
For 70 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anybody know their lifespan?
70 years?
50.
50.
They're 27 years too old for, and they've done marvelously, really, if you think about it. There are other things you might want to think about, like why were homes built that were in the pathway, right? Because they built that park over here, Story Park, with no homes in it. There's no homes in there. So when it flooded, you know, maybe some park benches got wet. But what, you going to say something, Mark?
No, I was just saying the universe is symbol for money.
Yeah.
Is the profit motive, probably.
Well, and also I would take it even more dark and say there's a genocide policy here. There's a genocide policy. There's a genocide policy. So, yeah, although $400 million, you know, relative to the cost we're paying now, doesn't it make you say, okay, we're never going to let this happen again? Next picture. No. Yeah, there we go. That is on Endicott and Braeswood, right after the storm. This is Meyerland. People have heard of Meyerland? They've had Houston, Texas. Thank you, Luis. This has been flooded now 3 times in 5 years, if I understand correctly. 3 times in 3 years, which was what, the Memorial Day flood and the tax day flood first, and then the Memorial Day flood, and then this latest, if I'm correct.
Memorial Day was first, then tax day, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so successive years, and we all remember these, you know, because it was, this area's been hit every time. And Brian Lance, who, by the way, did the conference call last night, recommend you hear it. And it's on our website, it's archived. Brian was pointing out that just to, you know, a lot of it, you don't see so much of it here, but a lot of these things, you're going to have refrigerators out. Somebody was telling me refrigerators out, you know, washing machines, stoves. How are you going to pick these up? Well, you know, you would think of like these big trucks that are used to pick up lumber, right? I think they're called self-loading cargo truck. There's 300 of them in the United States. That's all. 300? That's ridiculous. What about Irma? If we think it looks bad here, just what's Florida going to do? He said over 250,000 homes destroyed or severely damaged. The cost just to move that rubbish, enormous. Rebuild the 3rd time for many of these people. It's not just money, right? But just if you want to look at it in terms of money, it's heart-wrenching. So I think that is enough said. I wish I could show you this cartoon. During the flood, there was a very funny cartoon. I can't do some of the stuff on the line because it's YouTube, but there was a very funny cartoon of a big fat Bubba being carried out of the floodwaters. And it's a FEMA guy carrying him out, you know, risking his life to carry him out. And next to him is another FEMA guy. He's got a FEMA hat, carrying out children and a dog. And you see the whole area is flooded. And this big fat Bubba, with, you know, looking back, he's got a T-shirt on that says, "Get government off my back." And yet, if it wasn't for FEMA,
Right.
you know, he might not have gotten out of there. Huh?
Right.
Yeah, right. So with that said, I want to show you what government did in the period of Franklin Roosevelt. And big government, under the conditions of a constitutional system, as Franklin Roosevelt understood brilliantly, And, depending on the time, I can go through some of his background. There's no question that Franklin Roosevelt was a student of Alexander Hamilton. In fact, his great-great-grandfather, Isaac Roosevelt, was not only a very important part of the American Revolutionary War, but Isaac Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's great-great-grandfather, was a personal friend and collaborator with Alexander Hamilton, including setting up the National Bank. But I'll get to that later if we have time. Okay, so let's pull up the map of the Tennessee Valley just so you have an idea what we're talking about. We're talking about 7 states. Of course, most of Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, help me out.
Virginia,
Kentucky, okay. So this is not exactly, some boondoggle for a state, is it? And you've got a river, the raging Tennessee, that goes this way. That's how it flows. And inevitably, year after year, it would flood in areas. You'd have massive soil erosion. But there's a history I'm not going to go through, but this was an area that George Washington looked at one point for an outpost for the American Revolutionary Forces, but it was largely populated by Indians, and they got routed out by the Indians. And later in 1824, Secretary of War John Calhoun sent President James Monroe a report recommending the improvement of the Tennessee River at Muscle Shoals. I'm not sure I could find Muscle Shoals. I think it's near Wilson Dam, probably around here, maybe.
It's in Alabama.
Right there, and top left is Alabama.
Here?
Well, to the right.
Yeah, that's what I pointed. Okay, Muscle Shoals. And this is an area which is, you could integrate roads, canals, and rivers to connect the east part of the country to opening up of the west. That was a very big issue leading into Lincoln's period. That's one of the reasons Lincoln built the Transcontinental Railroad. By the way, with greenback policy, which is a Hamiltonian policy, to make sure we could secure our landmass from the British. Because we always have had the British wanting to take us back as a colony, and one of the vulnerabilities we had until we could get, transportation to the west was, they're taking part of our country back, taking it. So this was a very important idea. There was an area of 37 miles of rapids and irregular rock formations, and the Muscle Shoals is called. It had a sudden drop in depth and a surge in strong rapids, so ships couldn't go through there without being shipwrecked. And in 1824, Supreme Court Justice Marshall established very important exclusive control over interstate navigation was going directly to the federal government. It's not going to be about states' rights or private interests. This was a national policy. And in this area, 1916, you can pull the next slide, the National Defense Act authorized the Wilson Dam. This was for World War I. There are 2 nitrate plants, or were 2 nitrate plants for munitions development, and 2 steam-powered electric plants there. The dam was started, but it was not completed before the end of the war. And some of the pictures I found were postcards. They're kind of nice. It says, thank you. You can read it. Go ahead.
East view of Wilson Dam, Muscle Shoals, Florence, Sheffield, and Tuscumbia,
Alabama. So that's pretty impressive. Think of the power there. So by the end of World War I, the question was, well, basically the war effort was over, and you had all kinds of interests, like Henry Ford wanted to come in and buy up this area. You could imagine why, because if you think about the incredible power, hydro power, that was involved in this dam. But there was a Senator Norris from Nebraska who just fought tooth and nail not to let this area be taken over by private interests or commercial interests. He believed it was government property and had to stay in the government's control. And there was a period under Harding 1921 to 1923, President Harding was of the same school of economics that we are. He was of the American system. And he died mysteriously on a trip across the country, a train trip. He apparently ate bad oysters or was poisoned, is more likely. But under Harding, he had a real scoundrel of a Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon. A real scoundrel, kind of like Stephen Mnuchin, maybe. And, you know, there was a lot of push to take up these kind of projects. But Senator Norris of Nebraska, now, you know, did you see Nebraska in the map I pointed out there? Is Nebraska contiguous? No. But if you're thinking of a nation, and you're thinking of the importance of developing a nation, this is the way, you know, people would think. We're thinking of the nation. Senator Norris thought of the nation. And he did a lot of things to, you know, have a national bill, a federal bill of flood control. This was vetoed by President Hoover. First you had Harding, 1921 to 23. He dies mysteriously. In comes Calvin Coolidge. What do they call him? Silent Cal. And he comes from he's a second cousin of the Coolidge family that was involved in the opium trade with the British, the Boston families, okay? So, and Andrew Mellon and he are like, you know, hand in glove, right? I mean, this was a very terrible period. And Hoover was against the idea of public utilities. He said it was a degeneration. Now, keep in mind, at that time, there was huge investigations by the Federal Trade Commission investigating the Roaring 20s, we've all heard about that, and the private utilities who were price gouging and screwing the consumer. Let's just put it that way. So by 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt came in, there had been 138 legislative proposals to develop the Tennessee Valley. None of them had been passed yet. Next slide. Meanwhile, in 1929, then Governor of New York, Franklin Roosevelt, proposed the development of the St. Lawrence Seaway. You can see up there. So Franklin Roosevelt had already many of the qualities he then called upon later as president. He hated the idea of private interest being able to do things like be able to charge more for electricity in the United States than it would cost Canadians just across the border, that kind of thing. He hated the idea of these predators we're dealing with today. So after President Roosevelt won the election, just a few months after he had won, he accompanied Senator Norris to Muscle Shoals. And this became one of the first initiatives that Franklin Roosevelt launched. Next slide. Now, yeah.
Why is South Carolina white in that previous slide?
Go back.
They never joined the TVA or something?
You're asking me why?
South Carolina, yeah. Why is it not part of the?
We'll have to ask.
There's no rivers there that are part of
I
the
thought part of the geography. Okay, all right.
Okay.
same as in Florida.
Yeah. Now, this is just one of, you can find thousands, and you've probably seen many pictures of the poverty in particularly rural America in the period of the Great Depression. I will point out there does seem to be one car, but it looks pretty abject poor there otherwise, and you're still pumping water. And if you think of the conditions people suffered, if you think of the Confederacy, you think of the South. Remember Woodrow Wilson as president brought the Ku Klux Klan to the White House. So slavery, although it didn't officially exist by the time we're talking of the Great Depression, the system still exists. And it still exists today in a way, frankly. The way most people have to exist today, it is like a slave system. You're you're enslaved to having to work so many hours and have to make so much money and in a system.
Part-time, so instead of getting a full-time with
Right.
benefits, part-time.
Right. Part-time, 3 or 4 jobs, no benefits. You're always frazzled. You know, that's not a human existence. And At the time of the Depression, the worst areas of the country were the rural areas, and particularly the South. You know, if you think of what, you know, the best land had been taken by the slave owners. So much of the rest of the population, sharecroppers, black or white, ended up in the hills, where, you know, there was just tremendous erosion and poverty. And frankly, the average wage of the white sharecropper wasn't all that much more than the black sharecropper. And just to give you an example, in 1933, the average wage of the Tennessee Valley farmer, there's a farmer in Tennessee Valley, was about $639 a year. The national average of a farmer, otherwise in the nation, was approximately $1,800 a year. So it's 3 times more outside of the Tennessee Valley as a farmer, black or white, largely. And by the way, if you think about also this, the average wage of a non-agricultural worker, think of industrial centers like Detroit and other areas, was 4 times greater than an average wage of an agricultural worker. So in 1929, the industrial sector, 70% of industry was powered by electricity. You had Henry Ford's production line, which, just to give you an example, by 1925, a new car was rolling off the assembly line every 10 seconds. Whereas a decade earlier, it took about 14 hours to assemble one car. So that's already shows you the incredible advance of technology in some areas. And urban centers, people could purchase canned foods, washing machines, refrigerators, synthetic fibers, telephones. There were such things as motion pictures that had sound after 1927. And another big invention, besides the spreading of electricity, which happens under FDR, is radios. Next slide. Now this is one, again, of many pictures you could find of the erosion. Because, you know, the major cash crops were tobacco and cotton. And you had over 300,000 acres had been destroyed by this kind of farming, stripping the soil of nutrients. 4.5 million acres were on decline. You also had a lot of depletion of soil by copper mining, which just left vast areas just dead. More than 1 million acres of topsoil disappeared because of flooding and other reasons of bad management. Also, this was an area that had tremendous forests at one time of hardwood, but then I get what the act would have been, the Homestead Act, where people could come in for $25 an acre, buy it up, you know, and these lumber operations would come in, buy up the property and just strip all the wood out, so that eventually there's nothing to hold the water in the soil, right? The trees were just torn down and it was not managed properly. Next slide. Go ahead, Mark.
A lot of homes at this time are dependent on wood for heat too.
Exactly,
So
exactly. A lot of homes dependent on heat by wood. Sorry to show you another familiar scene. We've all seen this, but this was recurrent in the valley time and time and time again. So, decade, well, I think it's the 30s. I think it's
30.
Yeah, early 30s. I tried to pick pictures that were from the Tennessee Valley, not just, you know, national. So you also had fires would go out of control and millions of acres were destroyed that way. Otherwise, you had malaria was endemic in this region. You had 60% of the population had typhoid, smallpox, tuberculosis. So the day that FDR signed the TVA into law, people in the streets of Muscle Shoals danced and put off fireworks. Next picture. And that's Roosevelt signing. I believe that's Senator Norris all the way to the right. Anybody know anybody else in there?
Yeah, that's
Yeah, Senator Norris. Okay,
And what year and date?
that was in 1932, 33,
1932, what? Yeah, okay,
33, I'm sorry. And I believe it might have been about March. I didn't write it down.
okay.
Next one. Somebody asked something, I'm sorry.
They said Huey Long was the one.
Huey Long? That's Huey Long?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else know anybody else in there? Okay. So can somebody read that for me out there?
FDR's words.
This is what he said in a part of his thoughts on the Tennessee Valley. Go ahead.
Tennessee Valley Project, if envisioned in its entirety, transcends mere power development. It enters the wide fields of flood control, soil erosion, afforestation, elimination from agricultural use of marginal lands, and distribution and diversification of industry. In short, this power development of war days leads logically to national planning for a complete river watershed involving many states and future lives and welfare of millions. Never shall the federal government part with its sovereignty or its control of its power resources while I'm President of the United States.
Next slide. These are the three directors of the TVA. The man appointed by FDR to head the whole thing, as you saw on the left, Arthur Morgan, whose book is this. It's called The Making of the TVA. Are you sure I'm not breaking copyright laws here? The Making of the TVA. But that's not the book I recommend. There's some interesting things in here, but he seems to have an axe to grind. There's a lot of personality differences between himself and the fellow all the way to the right, whose name you probably have heard, David Lilienthal, who ultimately becomes the director of the project after a few years. Arthur Morgan is an expert in flood control, and I think he was brilliant at what he did. The fellow in the middle is Harcourt Arnold, who was I think he was the head of the University of Tennessee, expert in agriculture, who becomes one of the key people heading up the program to develop fertilizers for the region.
Morgan's part of the Morgan family?
No, not as far as I know. Good question. I don't know if he was part of the Morgan family. If he was probably like FDR, kind of or John F. Kennedy. Yeah, kind of a maverick thing. So, you can put the lights on for a minute. So, turn that off, or not, just cover the slide. So I just wanted you to think about how fast things moved back then. On October 1st, so he signs this into law, I believe it's in March of 1933. So
He didn't become president until March 4th.
So it was like March 5th, he signed it into law, something like that. By October 1st of 1933, what are we talking, 3 and 10, 7 months later, the first day of the fiscal year, the shovels are going into the ground, they're breaking the dirt, they're starting the construction of the Norris Dam, which I probably want to show you. I'll show you that in a minute, on the Clinch River. So within months. And I remember when there was an opportunity under President Clinton with the Palestinian leader meeting with the Israeli leader to build in the Middle East. And we had a whole program then called the OASIS program for the Middle East, largely based on water development for an arid area of the world. Lynn said, those shovels have to break the ground now. Get those shovels in the ground. And that's exactly what FDR did. And it's like what we have to do right now. When I get further on, you'll see what I mean. We can't be waiting around to see another flood come and say, oh, gee, we should have built that third reservoir around Addicks and Barker. There was plans for third reservoir. Now the politicians, they got religion, they're talking infrastructure, Dan Patrick and, Governor Abbott and all these people who said, we can't afford to spend the money. Tea Party types, and now they're saying, we got to have the projects, right? So they're talking about a third reservoir, which was designed in the 1940s. Okay? Now, I'm not against it, but that's not going to be enough. And there's a lot more that could be said of what we could do. But I'm just making the point. By 1934, a year later, over 9,000 people were employed at the Norris Dam. And within 20 years, there were over 200,000 people overall employed in the TVA project, over 20 years.
Over how many?
200,000, but that's just on the TVA. That's not all the ripple effect of the economy that would occur, because as people start to work, they earn income. They earn income, they can get homes that aren't shacks. They can start to get electricity into their homes. I'll get to that in a minute. They can get appliances. Well, guess what? A lot of that wasn't produced in the valley. So this was a very big gain for the US economy. And I bring this up now because you start talking about this with people, you're probably going to hear that FDR was a socialist. He was a damn socialist. No, this is American system. This is how you actually do make an economy work. Between 1933 and 1944, that's 11 years, 16 dams were built. By 1954, 10 years later, 20 dams. This is the equivalent of 12 times the bulk of 7 great pyramids of Egypt, the amount of concrete, rock, and earth. This is in Lilienthal's book.
20 dams are the TVA.
Yeah, I'll show pictures of a map in a bit. The dams can store 22 million acre-feet of water. That's enough water to cover the entire state of Illinois, 8 inches high.
All right.
Sorry, Ron and Diane, we don't want to do that to Illinois, but just so you have an image. And of course, it becomes a navigable artery stretching from West Virginia to the Ohio River, connecting the eastern United States to the Mississippi, something that any great thinker wanted to do. Lights off and next map.
So there's 20 dams total in the TVA project.
Well, there are, if I understand correctly, I'm not like an expert on it.
Yeah.
I had to really just dig this material up myself. I'd love to go there. Oh, Joe has something.
When you say navigable, so every one of the dams, there's a way for a boat to get from the top of the dam to the
Well,
bottom?
not everyone, but there is a navigable channel.
And I'll show you in a minute.
Sure.
I'll show you in a minute. There's a map of the locks, and you can see, what is. I mean, okay. So you want to pull that thing up? Okay. This is the Norris Dam as it is in construction. Oh, Mark, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Going back to your point about recent events and striking while the iron is hot, I think a lot, I suppose that a lot of the movement to have flood control built here in Houston was a result of the 1935 flood, which was very severe right here in the area, and it was further evidence that this is not an unprecedented event for the flooding that we've had.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've seen pictures of downtown Houston, and I don't know the year, but it was more flooded than even what we saw this time. And anybody tries to tell you this is because of man-made global warming, I'm sorry.
That's a lot of hot air.
That's a lot of wasted carbon dioxide. And remember, plants love carbon dioxide, so let's not waste it. Next. And this, next. This is a postcard of the Norris Dam. Next. Now, this is just gives you a better idea of the map. I can show you in the back of this book. It does have a really good diagram, which is not that, but I have the picture in one of the slides coming up. But they're, I can't say a lot more than I've said unless you have questions in particular. But they had a lot of tributaries to deal with. They had a lot of area that was in the hands of Indians. Joe, I had used a picture of Fontana Dam, which is coming up. Why don't we get there and I'll tell you the little story about it, and then Joe can tell us his story. Go ahead. Okay, now this is a quote from David Lilienthal, and I think it's quite LaRouche-esque. Could somebody read it for me? Good, nice and loud.
There's almost nothing, however fantastic, that given competent organization, a team of engineers, scientists, and administrators cannot do today. Impossible things can be done, are being done in this mid-20th century. No longer do men look upon poverty as inevitable or think that drudgery, disease, filth, famine, floods, and physical exhaustion are visitations of the devil or punishment by a deity. The quantity of electrical energy in the hands of the people is a modern measure of the people's command over their resources and the best single measure of their productiveness.
Productiveness.
Productiveness. Their opportunities for industrialization, their potentialities for the future. A kilowatt hour of electricity is a modern slave working tirelessly for men.
Now that's the kind of slavery we want. And that is really, a very poetic way of expressing what Lynn has talked about with this idea of energy flux density. And, that the question of whether we're going to move ahead ourselves to new realms of technology. Nuclear fission is not new, but we're in one heck of a fight on that. Nuclear fusion, what is it, 20 years in the future, 40 years in the future? According to the skeptics, but it's all about what's the commitment of the economy. If you spend the money to do the research, they did so much in this period. Show the next slide, Mike. Laying electrical wire. That had never been done, out in this area. I shouldn't say it hasn't been done. There was many areas that were being electrified. And Franklin Roosevelt developed the rural electrification program against a lot of private interests, that the Mellon interest, the Morgan interest, they didn't want this because they wanted private utilities. They wanted to control who had electricity and who didn't. Because, after all, they're racists. They view, human beings like animals, and their system is evil and British controlled. Go ahead. Looks precarious, doesn't it? Okay. Whoa. I know. Next. But with the development of electricity, doesn't this look like the old commercials? Somehow I remember these kind of commercials.
It reminds me of Amelia, what Robinson did.
The what?
Amelia.
Yeah, did what?
Robinson, yeah, she worked in rural
right.
Nutrition and
right. County agents, right?
Huh?
County agents type. So in 1933, only 1 out of 100 households in the Tennessee Valley had electricity. 1933. By 1934, 1 year, the TVA had 6,507 customers. And by 1942, 8 years later, they had 500,000. So a total of 18 years. In 1934, there were 0 transmission lines being built. By between 1938 and 1942, 5,000 miles a year were being built in the Tennessee Valley, I'm talking about. So over most of its history, the electrical rates, once this got established, was half the cost of the national cost of electricity, half the cost of what consumers would pay in other parts of the country, and and the usage was twice per capita of the rest of the country. Make it cheap, they're going to use it, right? And of course, most residents had to be trained. Using a stove, using a refrigerator, using, that's like what Diane was just saying. This is what Amelia and her husband did in Alabama and other areas, where you go out and go to the households, and there's a lot that's written about how they didn't want people with a suit and a tie to come in from the outside and try to convince people to go with the modern standard of living. Most of these people, you're talking about Appalachia, you're talking about the Smoky Mountains, you're talking about tremendous poverty. And so you had to, they'd really think about programs where they could take people from the region that were trusted by their neighbors and go to the homes and convince, or take them to a home. They had actually a model town in Norris, at the Norris Dam, called Norris Town. And they did, all kinds of public, open house kind of, tours that people could come in and see a modern kitchen, what it would look like. And yes, you too could have a modern kitchen, and you too could have access to electricity and let's see. What? Toilets, all the modern conveniences. Well, I'll tell you, my grandparents in New Hampshire, when I was growing up, had outhouses. They had outhouses up in New Hampshire until they died in the 1980s. So truly, and that's one of the reasons I love to go to my grandparents' house. It was so neat. Okay, next slide. Okay, one of the great achievements was the development of fertilizer. And what they did is they took the Muscle Shoals plant, the Wilson Dam, and the Muscle Shoals plant that was used for World War I. And Harcourt Morgan, with a team of chemists, went in and figured out that what was needed in the valley, this plant was producing nitrates for explosives for World War I, but the soil was completely depleted of phosphates. So they developed a whole fertilizer industry. And then again, how do you convince a farmer that you should take this out in your field? And I saw some of the, you can, by the way, get TVA films. I was going to try to show part of one, but copyright laws, I can't do it here. But you just look it up on YouTube or TVA. There's a lot of old government propaganda films, and really interesting to watch. And they would have farmers go to, farmers that were hesitant, go to a friend's field. They planted this field on exactly the same day, with plant food and without. And I think the results speak for themselves, right? Go ahead. And this became quite an industry. This guy, Harcourt Morgan, was able to coordinate with 7 state universities, the 7 states that were involved in the Tennessee Valley. And what they did is they set up programs for free distribution of the fertilizer. If you as a farmer were willing to use the fertilizer in the valley, you got it for free. And but it was also shipped all over the country. And between 1934 and 1955, it was 25% of the national fertilizer production. And by 1941, 47 states had tested the TVA fertilizer. Now, ultimately, this team cooperated with 48 fertilizer firms in 19 foreign countries. And by 1963, John F. Kennedy era, the TVA was training a group of Peace Corps members to go to Brazil. As staff members worked with the State Department, they went to Morocco, they even went to Korea to spread this wonderful miracle of fertilizers, of synthetic fertilizers. And I'm not sure where this figure comes from. I want to acknowledge the work of Marcia Freeman and Richie Freeman, because frankly, the EIR magazine we produce, you can read all the books you want. This is Lilienthal's book, and I highly recommend it. It's called The Democracy on the March, published in 1944. I think millions of copies were produced. It was translated into 17 languages. This is by David Lilienthal. 50,000 of these alone were in Chinese. But as wonderful, I think, as a thinker he became, I don't know all of his history, but nobody understands really what was done as well as we do. And I just want to acknowledge that some of what the material I'm using here today is from, Marcia Freeman and Richie Freeman. And this is one thing that Marcia says in her article, which is that it is estimated that 2 to 3 billion people are alive today because of the development of synthetic fertilizer, in terms of increasing the food production base. And we could go much further. I think we all know there's been a suppression of methods of increasing agriculture because, as we were saying earlier, the policy is genocide. And this is not what the oligarchy wants, but we're going to beat them. Okay, next slide. Also, you had very common in all of these towns where it sprung up, I mean, you'd have towns spring up at these dams, right? I mean, you have to have a place for the workers to live, but they were very determined. They would have areas where people could go and just read. And I have read before, but I didn't confirm it this time around, so I think I'm right. But I had heard years ago that they set up programs because a lot of these people came in were illiterate or really not well educated. And they would set up a schedule so they would work half the day. Maybe they'd be going out and learning a skill on some part of building a dam. And they'd be trained by apprentices. And then they begin to develop a skill set. But then the other part of the day would be to get education. So, and I just think today, you think of all these young people that are really, frankly, seemingly uneducable, unambitious, drugged up. I mean, we've given a terrible culture to these young people. What if we got this going? We got the dams and the flood control projects. Brian was looking up, there's a plan that would involve $25 billion. That's a small amount of what we would say. We'd say trillion to 8 trillion right away. I don't know that we could deploy that fast under a national credit system. Oh, that's for the, thank you, Joel. Not just for Houston. Yeah, although we might be able to use it all. We've got a lot to do at NASA and so forth. We've got a fellow here from NASA who could probably give us some good ideas where we could spend some of the money. But the idea is that that there was a very great concern that you develop the whole individual. I think this is an idea of dirigism, if I understand the concept correctly. I mean, it's not just building dams. It's not just fertilizers. It's a whole idea of the development of all aspects of the creativity of the human being. And then you develop an incredible workforce. And this is what was remarked on by people that would go into the valley and look at these people that were from the hills, might say hillbillies at one point, whatever words you want to use, Appalachians, but under these conditions developed incredible skills, pride of their work, and became some of the most important people, as I'll get to in a while, on World War II. Next slide. This was also very common, bookmobiles. And I don't think this was just in the valley, but next. And they had to deal with malaria. And I was curious about whether they had DDT by this point, but I don't think they developed DDT until World War II, if I'm not mistaken. But they had some kind of program of spraying. You can find the pictures, and in the films they show it spraying. Malaria affected 30% of the population in the region when the TVA was incorporated. And by 1947, the disease was essentially eliminated.
Oh, draining the swamp.
47.
Yep. So in 14 years. And as Diane said, it's called draining the swamp. Okay. I think we heard that sometime recently. Okay, next. This is the Douglas Dam. Now this is interesting because FDR had been trying to get funding for this dam. It's in eastern Tennessee in 1941. However, the day the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, guess what? Bill went right through Congress, and they got the appropriations for this dam. It was completed in a record-breaking 12 months and 17 days. So think of it as you're developing a skilled workforce. As they're cleaning off the tools, having completed one dam, they're deployed to the next area. And they've all developed these skills, and they're training others along the way. Think of that as a very good example of how we could take on the tremendous tasks we face today in rebuilding our country. Next. 1 day's power from Douglas Dam will make the aluminum to build 7 big bombers. So this was, this was World War II period. And there was a tremendous sense of patriotism in the Valley of what they were doing for the war effort. And I'll also mention that, next slide. Fontana Dam, and Joe can tell a story in a minute. Except this is the sign leading up to it, was constructed 1942 to 1944 by the TVA. At 480 feet, it's the tallest dam in eastern United States. I don't know if that's still the case. Next. And there's an architect sketch of the dam and the powerhouse. Now, when the TVA was first being set up, this area called Fontana was a privately owned area of Alcoa. That is Aluminum Company of America. That is Mellon owned, the banking family Mellon. They'd owned this property since 1886. And it's one of the most important acquisitions the TVA got because of the tremendous power. That's why they have located the aluminum production right there. Alcoa did. And this was a big fight. This wasn't just something where, the Mellon family gave up the plant, but it was just 10 days before Pearl Harbor. So there was a tremendous effort by the U.S. government to get this. It's in the remote Smoky Mountains in North Carolina. And I mean, just imagine you're in the middle of the wilderness. They're building railroad because they got to get supplies in. They got to get people in. So they're building railroad. You got to have dormitories. You got to have tents. You got to have houses. You got to have trailers. But almost overnight, this is what began to. This is how it built. I have an image of a mushroom, but I mean, it's just suddenly this activity, including a hospital, a bank, a library, a post office, and schools were all built from scratch. So again, it's this can-do spirit. Next. These TVA dams are needed for victory. This is the sense the workers had. Next. Out of the water power comes air power. This is a TVA war job. So in addition to aluminum, which is a very important component for our war effort, the Valley also processed metals, food, fibers for uniforms, timber, chemicals. They manufactured ship boilers, gas masks, and explosives. But something else interesting that would have never occurred to me is that you can turn the lights on for a minute, 470 TVA mapping experts and technicians were actually brought to the use of the United States Armed Forces for World War II. So 400, because imagine you're going to go into this area, you've got to have people who can survey the land, map it out, figure out where are the best places to put the dams, right? You don't just put it up because water's running rapidly. You got to figure out the best place. So it's all this skill. So these mapping experts were then deployed with the U.S. Army and U.S. Geological Survey. They produced 70 million maps, the TVA experts, that were used for the Normandy landing in June of 1944. 70 million maps. Well, I would imagine the troops, anyway. Yeah, in other words, they had to map, when I say 70 million, I don't think it's just simply a map for each person or something, yeah. But you're mapping out a whole area of territory and you have to know what's the geography. So that's another aspect of their war contribution.
And the installations. I mean, my dad was involved in advanced bombing for D-Day, and they said you have to go and hit this munitions plant, hit this facility, right?
Wow. Yeah. You were going to say something about your grandfather and Fontana Dam, right?
Well, it's not. I mean, it's just that Marcia had put out the had put out the invitation, and perchance chose this beautiful dam on the invitation, and it's a dam I have a certain childhood connection to because my grandfather, Robert Jennings, was with the Department of Superior in the Tennessee Valley, involved with a lot of the forestry issues, anticipation of this. And they in retirement, they moved, got a summer home in the Great Smoky Mountains, Fontana Village. So that was, when I was about 8 years old, my granddad took me. And he couldn't say, well, I built this, because he wasn't involved in building the dam, but it was still, he was a FDR Democrat all his life. And as I also told Marcia on that same trip, they also did a side trip to some Cherokee reservation in the Great Smoky Mountains. And I didn't find out until after they both died that one or both of my grandparents were Cherokee. You know? I mean, well, I've got a Cherokee blood in me. I didn't know about until very recently. So. But it was, it's just beautiful.
Yeah. Well, you reminded me of something, which is that they had a hiring policy. And I certainly, this wasn't prevalent in the South, but their hiring policy was that based on the percentage of blacks that lived in this area, that percentage of blacks was going to be higher. Percentage of Indians that lived in this area, that percentage was going to be higher. This was a, basically equal opportunity hiring program. And that was something that all three directors fought for. But that was FDR's view too. I mean, absolutely. And they did it brilliantly. Let's see. I have a few more slides. Why don't we just finish the slides and then. Oh, good. Thanks to give Joel a chance to talk. This is something else that was developed in the war effort. Anybody ever heard of Oak Ridge?
Yes.
Right. I had the experience of meeting a woman when I was on a deployment years ago down in League City, or maybe it was at Clear Lake, who worked at Oak Ridge. And this was the facility that was part of the Manhattan Project to develop the nuclear bomb. And she said that one day this man came into her. Now, you're not supposed to talk about what you're doing at your work. And I don't think she ever told me what she did. Of course, this is, she's retired at this point that I meet her. But she said, one day this man came into my office and I looked up at him and he's asking me, what are you doing? And I couldn't tell him. Well, it turned out it was Oppenheimer. It was one of the people that ran the program. And I didn't understand the importance of it when I talked to her years ago, but now I do. I asked Joel, did he just say a little bit about the importance of the Oak Ridge? Let me put the lights on. You want to come up here? Maybe people can hear you better. Yep, keep coming. Oh,
To the left.
yeah, I can leave. Just grab my elbow. Okay. I'm gonna go over this way. Oh, that's fine, Joel.
Well, the mic was here better.
Okay, you can hear it over here? Okay, I'm gonna pull you over here, sorry.
Oh.
I'm told that you'd be better if you're in front of the court.
I just played a piano.
I know, you can do that. To your right. I'm gonna play a little cat.
Okay.
Little more to your right. Okay.
Yeah, oh, just to go back to what William Paul said, an average human uses about 100 watts every second. So if you hire somebody to work for an hour, that's 100 watt hours. So if you have 10 people working for you for an hour, that's 1 kilowatt hour. So you can see you can either have 10 slaves or 1 kilowatt hour.
That's a good way to put it.
But Lyndon LaRouche called for building, not just rebuilding, but building 50 new cities. Now, the last time we actually built new cities was in the middle of the war. And part of the city building was the Manhattan Project. back in 1942, when the project was getting off the ground, the military director of the program, Leslie Grove, went to Tennessee. Leslie Grove was Army Corps of Engineers. He built the Pentagon, where he oversaw the building of the Pentagon. And he came to Tennessee and he picked an area which was near Knoxville, about 25 miles west of Knoxville, which had, in the area, had about 3,000 people. So he designated that spot as part of the Manhattan Project. Now, the reason why he picked that spot is it had good rail transportation, it had good roads, and it was near the Norris Dam. So it had ample water and electricity. Now, that area became Oak Ridge, and it was also known as the Atomic City. Now, it wasn't very well known until after the war because the whole area was fenced. It had 7 watchtowers, and people were sworn to secrecy. And what they were doing is they were using the electric power from the dam to run a gas diffusion, because in 1939 they had discovered that you can actually have a chain reaction from uranium. But uranium comes in 2 flavors, U-238 and 235. And 235 is the one that will actually have a sustained chain reaction. Problem is, in ore like yellow cake, 99.3% of the uranium is in the form of U-238. So in order to get something that will sustain a chain reaction, you have to increase the percentage of uranium-235 from 0.7% to over 90%. And the way they did it at Oak Ridge was they would get the ore, convert it into a gas, uranium hexafluoride, and push the gas through a series of membranes, like your coffee filter. And after pushing it through, the lighter versions of uranium would concentrate. So after thousands of this type of operation, you produce enough uranium to actually fuel the bomb that they were building. Now, it took over a year to get just a few kilograms. So the whole city went from a population of around 3,000 to over 75,000 people by 1945. So they had to build the housing, they had to build the streets, the power systems, the libraries, the symphony hall. So it was basically a self-contained city. And it wasn't just at Oak Ridge. You had the same process in Los Alamos in New Mexico, and eventually Hanford in Washington State. So from 1942 to 43, you had these series of actual science cities built literally overnight. And this was part of the Manhattan Project, which was an example of how to have a great science driver similar to the TVA. So this one was to actually produce something that eventually not just became the bomb, but eventually became nuclear power. So, you know.
I'll also say that when Betty and I made our trip down here from Virginia, we took the scenic route, and we went through Knoxville. Now we toured Oak Ridge. This would have been in 1989.
Oh, nice.
Right? And the tour guide was very bitter, because I think it was Martin Marietta that had taken over a lot of it back then. But they were very bitter as to what happened under Jimmy Carter at the Clinch River breeder reactor, which was the next step, right, for breeding dealing with the nuclear waste and so forth and so on. It was all sabotage. It was killed, and thousands of people were laid off and built cadre. And you could tell, that Oak Ridge was, beginning to waste away and just becoming a tourist thing of the industry that wasn't going anywhere at that point.
But they still do have pride though.
Oh, they did. They had a great deal of pride. In terms of, we saw the movie. It was amazing what they did, flying in these modular houses. Slapping them up like Tinker toys.
Yep.
Just like
Yeah.
thing.
And we could do it. We could do it today and better. The other thing I'll say about Oak Ridge is that after the war, this is the place that produced the world's first medical isotopes. So, if you ever get a CAT scan or is it an MRI? That's what they use.
From Oak Ridge.
That's where it was first developed,
Yeah.
medical isotopes. Now, for people to say that we don't know what to do with the nuclear waste and all that, well, I think there's a whole science to what we could do. Now, you can imagine that there were a lot of people that did not appreciate what Roosevelt was doing. There were dozens of lawsuits against the TVA. It cost them enormous amounts of money, lots of legal challenges that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And you can imagine after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, the question was, would this kind of thinking continue? And of course, we had Truman come in, Harry S. Truman, a little man, a real Wall Street British toady. Even so, under Truman, some of this impetus continued. You had a TVA project for the Columbia River, which was part of the Four Corners up here, the west. And Lilienthal was appointed as head of the new Atomic Energy Agency. But under Eisenhower, as much as I think Eisenhower is, no, go the other way, Mike. Oh, okay. He's going to show you the Four Corners again, so we can look at it. Eisenhower called the TVA, creeping socialism. And there's the Four Corners again. There's the Columbia River up there. So that was continued or escalated under Truman.
Wait, can you explain it again, the northwest area?
Yeah, well, this is called the Grand Coulee Dam, the Bonneville Dam, and the Columbia River Project. And I can't explain more than that, but that was a project that was continued under Truman. This was FDR's conception. They take the four corners of the United States, Hoover Dam down here in the southwest, which had already been started before FDR came in, of course, Tennessee Valley, the St. Lawrence River Seaway, which was started when FDR was governor of New York. And I want to go now to the next slide, which is the JFK. Because, I was also wanted to mention that a lot of people just objected to this being so concentrated in one place, and it's the JFK slide. But $1.4 billion was spent outside of the valley buying goods that were manufactured and brought in. So the idea that this was not a benefit to the whole country was provably wrong. Now, next is, this is JFK on the 30th anniversary of the Tennessee Valley Authority, May 18th, 1963. As this quote says, "Let us all resolve that we too, in our time, 30 years later, will ourselves build a better nation for generations yet unborn." Now, next, I'd like somebody to read the quotes. This is from John F. Kennedy's speech there. Can somebody see it and read it?
There are many who still regarded the undertaking with doubt, some with scorn, some with outright hostility. Some said it couldn't be done. Some said it shouldn't be done. Some said it would be done. But today, 30 years later, it has been done. Despite a record of success, TV still has its skeptics and its critics. There are still those who call it creeping socialism. There are still those, and some of them from Massachusetts, who say that this asset series serves only the valley. By working together, we have recognized that a rising tide lifts all boats, and that this valley will not be prosperous until other sections of the country are rich. nor will other sections of the country be rich unless the valley is prosperous. That is the lesson of the last 30 years. Finally, there are those who say that TVA has finished its job and outlived its challenges, but all of the essential roles of TVA remain.
Next, there's another slide. We're going to keep reading one more slide.
Oh, sure, yeah. In short, the work of TVA will never be done until the work of our country is done. Franklin Roosevelt came from Hyde Park, New York, more than 1,100 miles from the community.
His community.
From this community, right?
Right, this community, right.
Senator George Norris was not a representative of the state. He came from Cook, Nebraska, also more than 1,100 miles from this community. Senator Norris' favorite phrase was his reference and his dedication to generations yet unborn. So let us all resolve that we too, in our time, 30 years later, will ourselves build a better nation for generations yet unborn. JFK, May 18, 1963, the TVA's 30th anniversary.
Thank you. And I want to go to the last two slides. Oh, that's one slide I meant to show you. This just, and you can look at it later. It's in the back of this book if you want to see it more closely. It shows you the elevation level starting where the river starts and the locks and dams that were built all the way to the conclusion of the river. And it's kind of hard to read from there, I'm sure, but it's interesting to look at. It's a 650-mile stretch of river.
Oh, steamboats,
Oh, it has locks and dams. In fact, this, when they produced in Huntsville, Alabama, components for the shuttle, these locks were often used as a process of getting them down to Florida. So I want to show two last slides, and then, oh, yeah, that's one. Because I want to just make my point that this affected the whole world. This was as Franklin Roosevelt talked about, we want 1,000 valleys. There was a idea of a little TVA. They called it a little TVA in Haiti, Little Valley TVA in Haiti. That was being proposed in 1942. Puerto Rico, think of all that's just battered Puerto Rico. 1950s was called a junior size TVA. And there's a lot of interaction internationally, but I think this is rather significant since most of us have heard about the Three Gorges Dam that was built by China. Somebody I want to read about this side of the...
A large dam across the Yangtze River was originally envisioned by Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China. In his book, Plans of Nation Reconstruction, 1919, he stated that a dam capable of generating 30 million horsepower, 22 gigawatts, was possible downstream of the Three Gorges.
And I'm sorry, they didn't put the date of Sun Yat-sen, but I believe he's the turn of the century into the early 1900s.
And that book was
Does it say that? Oh, 1919. I'm sorry, I didn't see that. You read it, but I missed it.
The other one?
Yes.
John Lucien Savage, December 25th, 1879 to December 28th, 1967, was an American civil engineer. Among the 60 major dams he supervised the designs for the Hoover Dam, the Shasta Dam, the Parker Dam, and the Grand Coulee Dam in the United States, along with surveying for the Three Gorges Dam in China.
Which of course was of magnitudes far greater than the TVA. Next picture. This shows a sketch, and it's really hard to see, but there's numbers of 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, they're obviously looking at probably stages of how the dam would be built. Next. And that's a kind of a pretty artistic rendering. So the idea is that, you can put the lights on, that we have to go back there to this kind of thinking. This is American system, and this is what Lyndon LaRouche, as a pre-presidential candidate in 2002, developed the idea of a super TVA. And I think maybe now we could better appreciate it today, even after what we've all gone through here. We can solve these problems very quickly if we have the mindset to do so, and you have to have the economics to do so. And perhaps you all came here today and said, oh boy, I'm going to learn about how they finance the TVA. I really want to understand credit, Hamilton, because frankly, this is really the challenge for what we have to do now. I did elicit a promise from Brian Lance that he would put a discussion together on how this was actually financed, but there was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was set up under Hoover. There was the Federal Reserve had a lending window. The TVA itself issued bonds. Of course, once they started producing, there was a certain profit made from the production of what they produced in the Valley.
And the head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was Jesse Holden Jones.
Yep, from Houston, from Texas. It was Houston?
Yep, let's repeat that.
Go ahead, Betty.
Jesse Holden Jones from Houston.
Was the head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Okay. One thing that Brian did put out, I just wanted to quote from him, and we can open it to discussion. Regarding, there's all kinds of proposals now, Governor Abbott, as I was saying earlier. But the question is, how are these things going to be financed? And what Brian pointed out, he said there's a broad back and forth going on, but we are intervening from the standpoint of national credit. For example, there is existing a North American Development Bank created as part of NAFTA. I didn't know that. It is jointly capitalized by the US and Mexico and has leveraged over $500 million into low billions of dollars in infrastructure on both sides of the border. It's now headquartered in San Antonio. And the former head is now Mexico's ambassador to the United States. So the idea of national credit, as Alexander Hamilton understood it, as Abraham Lincoln understood it, as clearly we know McKinley understood it, Franklin Roosevelt understood it, John F. Kennedy had an understanding, conception of how to use credit to launch these technological revolutions. This is the key to the moment, because most of the presidents that went back to the American system of economics were killed in office. Franklin Roosevelt barely averted being killed because he was at an event after he'd been elected, before he was inaugurated, I believe in Florida. He was with the mayor of Chicago, Cermak, and as the two were up on the platform, a lady pulled out a gun to shoot the president, and somebody, or a man, I'm sorry, it was a man, and a lady pushed the arm away so it killed Cermak, but it did not kill FDR. So, and you could go back to our best presidents. They were either killed in office or they were targeted. So you have to realize what President Trump is up against. For him to do what we're saying to do, it's going to take a lot more of us out organizing the population, and particularly to study the economic ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. So with that, I'll open it to questions. Diane, or comments?
I just thought that your presentation really brings up an important question, which is, so many people have in their minds that, yeah, we did all that because of World War, and that's what we have to do. And in a certain sense, the flooding and so forth is that kind of a motivation. But if you look, it began during the Depression, the collapse followed by the Depression, and that's what we've got. We've got a situation in which using that credit idea, creates, what we did in the 30s was transformative. That's why we were able to fight World War II. That's why all this became possible. It didn't, if people put the egg before the chicken or something,
Right.
They don't get it, that we could not have had that war of mobilization and all of the industrialization and so forth and the breakthroughs in science.
In-depth logistical.
Right.
Now today we've got China, who is ironically taking up the role we had in leading the world on development, and really with the ideas of LaRouche, with the ideas of Alexander Hamilton. These are principles. And Russia's moving in that direction to the best of their ability. So
What about the Inga Dam and on the Congo?
yes, I've heard about it. I know Jason's put some stuff together about it. What, you want to say anything about it particularly?
I think that's going to be bigger than the Three Gorges.
Yeah. 40 gigawatts of power on the Congo. And the Chinese are helping to build it, right? Built the Three Gorges Dam. That's right. Instead of building a wall, we're going to build a dam. In fact, there was a New York Post.
Instead of that damn wall.
That's right. There you go. There was a New York Post. Yeah, there was actually a New York Post article with that headline, "Build the Damn Wall." And it was actually about what
No.
No, build the
DAM, build the damn wall. And it was actually about build the damn wall, what Houston needs. The ever-rising toll of no, that's the title. And it was about actually comparing the breakdown of the state of infrastructure of New York City and Houston. You know, New York City, Superstorm Sandy really highlighted that many of these tunnels are 100 years old. And I don't know if people heard, but President Trump just agreed with some Democrats, like Senator Schumer, that what's called the Gateway Project in New York is going to be financed. This has a lot to do with repairing old tunnels and I think connecting the airports and probably some security on the coastline. It's very inadequate. I think it's $150 billion. But, you know, as one person put it, maybe $1 trillion of credit starts with $1 billion. You know, the Chinese have a slogan about a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. So things are going in the right direction, but not fast enough. And that's the point. You know, I talk to people every day on the phones who have, and you all do, I'm sure, have horrible stories to tell about what happened to them or loved ones with this flood. And as I opened the meeting by wanting to dedicate this meeting to Keisha, because she inspired us through the whole process with this beautiful piece that was done on the New York Times. Now, how many people have not seen that piece?
The video clip you mean?
Yeah.
Can we show it right now?
Well, I can't do it with the camera on. So is there anything else?
The camera on.
Yeah,
Well, we'll tell people how to see it.
I will. Thank you, Louise. We're going to conclude, but let me tell people, if you don't or haven't seen this, this is the beautiful Keisha Rogers, one of our top people here. After we had all gone through this storm, I showed you Story Park, played a role in saving our area of the city here from the worst kind of damages we've seen. We got the terrible news on August 30th that Keisha's dad and stepmother had drowned on a mission to go try to find out what's happening with his uncle. And this was just gut-wrenching for all of us. So during this period, we're all, you know, trying to keep the organization going, and we continued organizing from our homes, you know, till we could get back in the office. But the New York Times took an interest in a special interest story of Harvey from Texas, and Keisha's family, the Rogers family, was chosen as one of the special interests. And her family's very well known in the area of Polshire. For 100 years they've had farming out there. So even during all of this, she managed to continue to inspire us. That's my message. So we'll close it for today. Thank you for joining us, and then we can play it for those who'd like to see it.